The recording will be uploaded to the GSAS YouTube channel, so if you'd like to go back and review any portion of this presentation, you will be able to do so on GSAS YouTube. Also, this session is specifically for international students, so if you're a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, you can also go to the GSAS YouTube channel to review last week's workshop that was specifically for U.S. citizens and permanent residents. With that out of the way, I'd like to welcome everybody on behalf of the Office of Financial Aid and the Graduate Student Council to today's tax presentation. Today we're joined by Shay, the Treasurer of the Graduate Student Council, and Daryl Ziegler from the Harvard International Office. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat. The chat will be monitored and there will be time at the end of the presentation to address questions. So please feel free to go ahead and put your questions in the chat. And with that, I will turn things over to Shay, and then Bob will begin his presentation.
Okay, wonderful. Hi, everyone. So my name is Shay, and I serve as the treasurer for the GSAS Student Council. We're so happy to partner with the GSAS Office of Financial Aid and Robert Underwood to bring you this event today. This is an initiative by the GSAS Student Council to provide the GSAS community with more support and programming to improve your Harvard graduate experience. We hope that you'll stay connected with us through our page on Engage and find more ways to get involved. And with that, I'll hand it over to Robert Underwood. Thank you.
Thank you, Shay. I appreciate the opportunity to do this presentation, which has been part of my life for the past number of years. Basically, what we're doing here today is what I often refer to as International Taxation 101. Pretty broad overview in terms of what potentially your responsibilities are with regard to filing income tax returns with the U.S. government and possibly with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, if applicable. So as you can see in the initial slide here, there is an email address, which is my email address. And I suspect at some point along the way, you may very well have a question, whether it be later today or anytime in the future. Feel free to reach out, contact me by way of email, and I will get back to you as soon as I can to respond to any questions you might have. So feel free to use that as a resource, and hopefully we'll get you through this process. The one thing I want you to keep in mind is simply this: there's no need for any anxiety with regard to filing a return, making sure it's accurate and all of that. At this point, I suspect in your lives, although there are exceptions to the rule, your tax situation is probably pretty basic and pretty simple. So we'll be able to walk you through the process and allow you to prepare, if necessary, the appropriate tax filing or filings that you need to make with either the U.S. government or the local Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So please don't be filled with anxiety, number one. Number two, do not wait till the last minute. Because obviously, if you have questions or concerns, if you wait to the last minute, you may not be able to get those questions answered quickly enough. So the 11th hour is not necessarily a good case. I've been dealing with that for many, many, many years now. For example, October 15th is the final last deadline date to file returns. And believe it or not, between now and October 15th, I have several clients who have sort of delayed doing this, and it's sort of an annual ritual for me, but that's the nature of my business, so to speak. So keep that in mind. Now, joining us today is Daryl Ziegler. He's from the International Office. And I'm going to reach out to Daryl that during the presentation, typically we sort of hold questions until the end of the presentation. But if during the presentation there is something, a topic that I'm covering, and there is something that Daryl, you need to interject with regard to possibly something specific to the university with regard to maybe policy or procedure, by all means, please interrupt the presentation and add that particular specific information to make that available to the participants. So I encourage you to jump in anytime.
Thanks, Bob.
Okay, please do again. All right, so basically, if we could go to the next slide. Our sort of agenda today is to discuss how you're going to file. We're going to define the definition of a non-resident, your tax filing requirements, if any, and if any, it may be minimal, and we'll get into that shortly. Familiarize you with some tax forms that are used, income tax treaties and types of income in their taxability, state taxes if applicable, and then some useful tips and resources. And then finally, we'll end with a Q&A. So we'll try and get through this as quickly as possible, enlighten you with regard to what you should anticipate with regard to the process and the forms and so on and so forth. So having said that, let's move on to the next slide. And we'll talk about how to file. Now, the university, and I assume that's the case for this coming tax year. And when I say this coming tax year, in the United States, the filing of income taxes for individuals is based on a calendar year. So, and the tax system itself is based upon the income that you may earn during the course of that calendar year that might be subject to U.S. and local income taxes. So bottom line, if you don't have any income, U.S. source income, then the likelihood of you needing to file a U.S. or state income tax return is unlikely. So again, for many of you, that may very well be the case, and not that you should sort of turn off this presentation at this point in time, because there are other requirements that you possibly may need to fulfill. But basically, if you have no U.S. source income, you have no reason to file a U.S. non-resident income tax return. Now, the university, and that's through Daryl's office, basically, and I hope this is the case, and Daryl can correct me if I'm wrong, the university has licensed an online tax preparation software known as SprintTax. And SprintTax is basically designed, and many universities across the country use this particular product to help their student body to prepare an appropriate income tax return for non-resident alien taxpayers. So basically, what the tax software will do is once you enroll in the use of the software, and there, as I understand it, you will be hearing from the university, again through Daryl's office, I believe, of the fact that the software, and probably not available at this point in time for the calendar year 2022, but I'm sure it should be available shortly after the turn of the calendar year.
So Bob, if I could just interject here.
Go right ahead.
So the SprintTax software is something that the Harvard International Office licenses for use by Harvard individuals. Our license will provide for free preparation of your base federal return and the required federal tax notice. There are two things. There's always one thing that you have to do to notify the government that you are a non-resident in the US. And then there's another that you have to do if you have income to actually file taxes. So the software will assist you with that. We will be sending out notifications about starting preparation for the tax year in January.
Okay, great. Thank you, Daryl. That's obviously, and obviously you give, I assume you will provide each individual with some type of access code, which they'll be able to access the software online.
Right, there will be a discounted access link.
Okay, very good, very good. All right, so as the slide presents, basically, you will use this software, and it's menu driven. To be honest with you, I've never used the software. Obviously, in my practice, I do have a professional tax software that will prepare a non-resident return. But basically, the software is menu driven, and obviously, in going through the process, it's important that you provide complete and accurate information during the input process. One thing I need to remind you all of is it can sometimes be tedious in terms of going through the process. I think we could all remember that at some point along the way, you needed to read the question being asked of you thoroughly so that you understand it thoroughly, so you respond accurately. Because needless to say, if you have a series of questions presented to you by the software, it's important that you accurately respond to the question so that the software can lead you in the appropriate direction, so to speak, in terms of preparing an accurate income tax return. So be patient in going through the process. You obviously have the ability to start up stop your session if need be and return to it to the conclusion in terms of preparing the appropriate return. So, if you need to break away for some reason, don't rush through the process. You can go back in and resume the process and pick up where you left off. Now, as I stated earlier, if you are deemed, and we'll talk about your residency status, but if you are deemed to be a non-resident alien for U.S. income tax purposes, it's possible that if you have no U.S. source income, then you have no income tax return that you will need to file. And in the U.S. system, basically, the income tax is predicated on your income. If you have no income, you have no income tax return to worry about. As Daryl noted, one of the items that you would be required to file is a Form 8843, a copy of which I will present when we get to the forms section of the presentation. But basically, this is an information form that non-residents need to file with the U.S. government. So if you're in this particular form is prepared by the Sprint tax software. So at a minimum, again, if you have no income, the only form that the software will prepare for you and prepare accurately is the Form 8843. And again, we'll introduce you to that form momentarily. So just keep that in mind. But again, the software is the key to your success. I would not attempt to prepare the appropriate returns using any other software, and I'm not promoting this for any particular reason, but basically this is clearly designed for you folks in mind. So definitely reach out to the international office and get that access code and go through the process.
Bob, if I could interject here, because that's a very important point.
Go ahead.
Unless you have been in the U.S. for at least 5 years and 183 days, you are not a U.S. tax resident, and therefore you cannot use the commercially available software products out there. That means no tax, no TurboTax, TaxCut, TaxSlayer, or any of those things. Those are designed for domestic tax filers, which most of you will not be. There are only 2 international tax programs that are available, and we have licensed 1.
Very good, good point in that respect. And as a matter of fact, if we go to the next slide, we'll sort of touch on that, so to speak, with regard to the tax definition of a resident versus a non-resident. I suspect, as Daryl indicated, I suspect many of you, if not all of you, would be considered or treated as non-resident taxpayers in the United States. So basically, the definition basically states that non-resident for tax purposes is defined as a foreign national that has not obtained a green card or been in the U.S. more than 183 days during a calendar year. That is known as the substantial presence test. There are exceptions with regard to counting those days, and those exceptions are if you are a scholar with a J or a Q visa, you do not need to begin counting days to establish you as a resident for this under the substantial presence test. And generally speaking, if you're a Q or a J scholar, your presence in the United States in terms of counting these days is accepted for the 2 calendar years. And then once you have reach that 2 calendar year period, then you begin counting days and you may possibly be deemed as a resident for U.S. tax purposes. So I suspect for the most part, the audience here today are for the most part, F visa holders. And basically, in that case, if it's an FJ, a student, as a student under an FJ, M, or Q visa, you remain a non-resident for 5 calendar years. So that gives you the time to obviously complete your studies and remain as a non-resident. So that's the general rule. Basically, the one thing I think that, and this might be addressed to Natasha, unfortunately, she's not here, but maybe Daryl can jump in. Obviously, it's my understanding the university needs to determine what your tax residency is and so forth, and that can be done through a process that the university uses is the Glacier system.
Right. So yes. So what happens is that anyone who's being onboarded at Harvard, who's going to receive a payment, they are asked to complete a Glacier profile so that the university knows that you are not a U.S. citizen, and then you will answer certain questions within the system. That system will then determine, based on the length of time that you've been in the U.S. and your immigration status in the past, whether or not you are a non-resident or resident for taxation. And that is important for GSAS students, particularly any first-year students. If you are a resident for taxes, no taxes will be withheld from your first-year fellowship payments. So just remember that you'll need to self-report that income, because you won't get a tax reporting document.
And that's important to keep in mind. So that Glacier, the interaction with the Glacier should be done annually, Daryl?
Generally, it's done once, and then upon any changes in the person's status.
Okay, all right. So that, because I've experienced over the years students that their classification, they've been misclassified, and I think it's because of a lack of going through that process when there is maybe a change in their visa status or whatever the case may be. So keep that in mind with regard to going through that process so that the university fully understands what your status is. So having said that, let's move on to the next slide. All right, tax filing requirements. When we talk about tax filing requirements, I may be repeating myself to some extent, but basically, if you are deemed to be a non-resident, you're required to file the following forms if you're an FJ, or Q visa holder. And that's the Form 8843, which again, we'll introduce you to in terms of its likeness, so to speak. And then if you have income, you're going to file a Form 1040-NR for any U.S. source income that you receive during the calendar year. All other visa holders would then, if they have U.S. source income, would file a Form 1040-NR. And again, we will make that presentation shortly with regard to that specific form. And again, as I stated earlier, our tax year for individuals runs on a calendar year from January to December. All right, next slide. And we'll introduce you to some forms. Some of these forms are a bit dated, but the fact of the matter is there's just some subtle changes with regard to what they look like. But basically, what you have before you is the page 1 of the 2020 calendar year tax return for a U.S. non-resident alien income tax return filing. And basically, as you can see, we start off by including your name, address, some vital information, and then the lower sort of half of the form is basically where you would enter the appropriate information. Again, when using the Sprint Tax software, you'll be entering the data in. You're not going to be physically entering the data into the form itself. You will be entering the data through various menus, which will be requesting this specific information. So, but the end result will be what you're looking at, or a facsimile of it, so to speak, in terms of where your income is going to be reported. Now, if basically, for the most part, the information that you'll be reporting on this document, this form, tax form, will be in lines 1A, 1B, and basically those two lines deal with the 1A being if you've earned any wages that you need to report, and line 1B, if you have any taxable scholarships or fellowships that have been awarded to you, would be listed on line 1B. There are other lines there, as you can see, and we'll talk about the other sources of income that might be presented on this income tax return if you, in fact, have those U.S. sources of income. Up until very recently, it's sort of been prompted more so, accelerated, let me use that word, accelerated, in terms of filing electronically. The U.S. government, I don't know how far back it goes, but basically, obviously, with technology the way it is, in the ease of filing electronically, more and more taxpayers, both U.S. citizens and non-residents, are now filing electronically. So the Sprint software affords you the opportunity to file your return electronically. Up until about 2 or 3 years ago, the Sprint tax software and any other software preparing non-resident returns would require that you file a paper return, which would mean that after you've completed the return, the software would allow you to print it out, and then you would physically mail it to the appropriate address where the form needs to be filed. Now the government has sort of accelerated the process, and I think the pandemic may have had something to do with it. And you may have heard in the news that our United States Treasury, which the Internal Revenue Service comes under, has been strained to the point where there are millions of returns paper returns that have been filed that haven't been processed. It hasn't been much fun over these last few years in terms of my profession with regard to filing returns, communicating with the IRS, and so on and so forth. Things are certainly getting better. So if you do need to file a U.S. income tax return, by all means, file it electronically for 2 reasons. It's going to go straight to the Internal Revenue Service computers. It's going to get processed more quickly. And more importantly, if you're entitled to a refund, that is going to happen much sooner. So if we can go to the next slide, I just want to point something out.
I'm sorry, Bob, can I interject?
Go ahead, Daryl. Go ahead.
Right, so the IRS does allow electronic filing for a very small subset of non-resident filings. And the people who go through SprintTax, there will only be a minute number of them who will meet those very fine criteria for electronic filing. So almost everyone will have to submit a paper return. And I'm going to warn everyone right now, as Bob has said, the IRS is still severely backlogged, and paper returns are the lowest. I don't know how to say this, are sort of the lowest thing, the last thing that gets worked on, because they require a human or some other intervention to actually go through the information. And so those returns, if they generate a refund, those refunds are going to come sort of at the end of the cycle. And we still have people from 2022 filings or 2021 that are still waiting for refunds.
Hey, Daryl, can you just sort of elaborate with regard to your indication that only a small subset? What would prohibit someone?
I don't have it right in front of me, but I believe I took what we got from SpringTax and put it on our tax FAQ. So
Okay.
that people would be able to self-identify whether or not they would be able to file. But based off of anecdotal evidence from the last 2 years, it is a very small number.
I see. All right. I'll have to look at that just to sort of have a greater understanding as to why, because I was under the impression, and wrongly, I imagine, that now they have, allowed, there was a point where obviously only a paper return could be filed. But obviously there's some further restrictions with regard to maybe all non-residents filing electronically. So I'll take a look at that.
So we'll actually have more information once we get closer to the close of the tax year.
Yeah.
Because SpringTax is always waiting for some final specs to come in from the IRS to set up the software. And so perhaps it will be better this year, but what I have explained has been the experience for the last couple of years.
Oh, okay. All right. Well taken from that standpoint. But what I wanted to point out, and as Daryl indicated, if you end up filing a paper return, unfortunately, the wheels turn slowly with regard to processing those returns. And again, where the Internal Revenue Service had a number of people out of the office, as I understand it, they literally had stack upon stack of paper returns that couldn't be processed under normal circumstances. So there can be a delay. And I have had clients who are still waiting for refunds from the 2020 tax year. So it's a bit insane. The point I wanted to make is I believe you can see online on that back page that we're viewing now online, specifically lines 35 A, B, C, D, C, and D, you have the ability to identify if you are getting a refund. It's possible that you could be overpaying your taxes as a result of maybe some treaty provisions that apply, which would lessen your income, which would lessen your tax. But if your tax that has been withheld at the source is greater than your ultimate tax liability, you're entitled to a refund. So just because taxes have been taken out of the payments that you've been made to you doesn't necessarily mean that the exact amount of income tax has been withheld, and that you shouldn't anticipate getting a refund or in fact owing additional money. So you need to go through the process in terms of preparing a return. But again, on lines 35A through D, you have the ability to include a bank account information, which would allow the IRS, once the return is processed, to be able to refund that money to you electronically to a specific bank. And obviously, for many of you, you may be traveling, you may not necessarily be in the area with regard to waiting for a paper check. Again, if you don't ask for a direct deposit, you're going to wait for a paper check. And if you're not physically where the check is addressed to, or if you've moved or relocated, obviously things are just going to be in limbo, and it's going to be a long time before you can sort of recover that refund under those circumstances. So I greatly encourage you to identify a specific bank account that will obviously remain open, that the government can make this direct deposit to that account. And then obviously you don't necessarily need to wait any extended period of time. So keep that in mind. Very important to expedite that process. All right, next slide. This is an abbreviated, I've sort of expanded it, and basically this is that Form 8843. And this is just basically a statement identifying you as a non-resident in the United States. And it's just basically an information return. There is no income tax that is associated with it. You're just basically sort of declaring to the US Treasury who you are and that you're a student in the United States and you've fulfilled your requirement. If again, this would be the only form that you would file if you had no US source income to report on that previous form, the 1040 NR. So if this is the form you need to file, the software will produce it for you, and it'll either be sent electronically, and if not sent electronically, you'll mail it to the address as instructed by the tax software. So just keep that in mind. And again, for many of you, this may very well be the only form you need to file. So that's the Form 8843. Let's go to the next slide. And what we have here is a facsimile. It's dated 2016, but the fact of the matter is this is a W-2 form. This is a wage and tax statement. So if you were employed, whether it be through the university or elsewhere, you would anticipate receiving a W-2 form. They come in sort of many shapes, sizes, and colors, but the bottom line is this: there's exactly 20 lines on the W-2 form, which are the same on this W-2 form as the one that the university might issue or one that an employer might issue to you, with obviously the relevant information being your name, address, your tax identification number, and obviously what wages you earned. As you can see in this case, John Doe earned $4,400. That's so reflected in box 1 of the return. There were federal income taxes taken out. That's reflected in box 2. So whether it's this facsimile of a W-2 you receive or another facsimile of a W-2, there'll be box 1, which will have the same information on each, box 2, and so forth. So if you have been employed, whether it again be the university or an outside employer, you should anticipate receiving this tax form by the end of January following the close of the calendar year. So come this January of 2023, you should anticipate receiving the W-2 form. If by chance you don't receive it, it would certainly make sense for you to reach out to your employer and ask why you haven't received it. And I'm sure they'll follow up and make sure maybe they have a wrong address or something to that effect. So again, this would be one of the forms that you would use during the input process when using the Sprint tax software. And again, you'll be called upon to take the appropriate information from the form and enter it into the software if applicable. All right, next slide. All right, this form here is a Form 1042S. Again, it's dated 2016, but the fact of the matter is the format of the form hasn't changed all that significantly. Basically, as you can see from the title of the form, it's a foreign person's U.S. source income subject to withholding. So if, for example, you might be receiving some type of financial resource from the university that would be subject to withholding, the university would issue this document to you. And I believe in years past, my understanding, I'm not exactly sure why, these seem to get out a little later than usual, and I'm not exactly sure why. With the W-2 form, again, they should be issued to the recipients by the end of January. In the case of the 1042S that the university might be issuing, they may be coming out a little later. So be patient. I'm sure there'll be some indication as to when they may be distributed or issued.
I can tell you that, Bob.
Okay, go ahead.
So the federal deadline is March 15th,
Okay, all right.
and we're always right there.
Okay, if that's the deadline, that's the deadline. So
Right.
obviously, you know, if the form is issued on March 15th, and I didn't mention this earlier, with regard to the filing of the Form 1040NR, the initial due date of filing Form 1040NR is generally April 15th. If April 15th happens to fall on a weekend, then it's the due date would be moved up to the next business date. So in any event, obviously, if the 1042S gets out to you by March 15th, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's when you need to begin the process of using the SprintTax software. It certainly wouldn't hurt to begin the process of sort of acclimating yourself to the software by going in and sort of, again, acclimate yourself with regard to, you know, how it operates, so to speak, what the menus are like and what have you. And then obviously, once you get the 1042S form, if it's applicable to you, then obviously you can enter that information and get ready to go and get your return prepared well ahead of the April 15th due date. Now,
I want to second that. I want to second that 100%.
Okay. Exactly. Because the last thing, again, as I stressed earlier, don't wait till the 11th hour, okay? It just doesn't make sense. It's needless, so to speak, from a standpoint of at least your filing requirements at this point in time. Now, there may be an exception or two with regard to you out there in terms of other circumstances, what have you, but at the end of the day, your returns are going to be pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Let the software do the work for you and get it over and done with. You've got a lot of other things you need to be concerned with, okay? All right, next slide. In all of these forms, the W-2, the 1042S, in this one that we're introducing to you to is Form 1099 DIV. These are all what we refer to as information returns or information documents. And these documents are produced for a reason, and the reason is simply this: to inform you, the taxpayer, of the sources of income that you need to report on your U.S. Return. And they also serve another purpose. A copy of these documents go to the IRS, and I guess you can imagine what should happen, and what does happen more often than not, is these documents are compared to the return that you file. It's obviously a way of keeping everyone honest to some degree. The tax system in the United States is voluntary, and basically if you have income from whatever source derived, that income has to be reported on your U.S. return, and it's a volunteer system. Although there's been discussion recently where basically, if enough of this, obviously with technology today, if enough of this information can be transmitted to the IRS, there's talk today about the IRS basically sending a completed return to taxpayers to sign off on and file. So that day may come, I may not see it in my lifetime, but basically we're sort of heading toward that, so to speak. This particular form, again, 1099 DIV, is a dividend and distributions document. And basically this particular form would be issued if if you have any marketable securities that would be paying dividends. This is the document you would receive from your investment company, identifying what dividends you received during the tax year. So if you have any U.S. source dividend income, then it would be reported on the Form 1040NR. All right, next slide. Another companion form or information form would be the Form 1099 INT. This is an interest statement. If you are receiving any interest on funds that you may have deposited with a bank or other type of financial institution, they will send you this 1099. These forms should be issued to you by the end of January, unlike the 1042S. But the dividend statement, the interest statement should be issued to you by the end of January by the financial institution. So on this particular tax form, you'll see, as you can see on line 1 of the form, where the interest amount that you received during the calendar year is reflected in that box of the form. So if you have any interest income that you've earned, you should get this form. The form is required to be issued by the institution if you earned more than $10 in interest. If it's less than $10, then the financial institution, because it's a de minimis amount, the financial institution is not required to issue the 1099.
Is the interest or the dividend still taxable even if it's under $10?
It's a good question in that the interest income, if it was $9.99, it's still reportable. It's still reportable. The one thing is, at this point in time, the government knows you never received it. And obviously, if it was overlooked on the return, and I'm certainly not encouraging that, but basically income is income. So whether it's been reported to you or not on some type of information document, it's still reportable. So that $9.99 should be reflected on your return. Next slide. Yeah, let's just briefly talk about U.S. source income. The common types would be wages, salaries, and compensation that you might receive from employment, whether again it be with the university or some outside employer. We have scholarships and fellowships covering costs other than tuition and other required fees, which we'll talk about momentarily. If you're self-employed, if you're working in a self-employment situation where you've started your own business and you're doing work, whatever it might be, tutoring or what have you, and you're offering tutoring services to individuals, that would be considered self-employment income and reportable. If you have investments that are generating income, U.S. source investments, that would be reportable. Again, dividends and interest, which we talked about with regard to the 1099. And then if you have any real estate that may be generating a rental income, that would be reportable as well. If, for example, you have a treaty provision that you can take advantage of, which the software will clearly help you with, that income, although it's not taxable on your 1040 NR, it still needs to be reported. And again, it's nothing you need to worry about, because if the software, again, if the appropriate information is provided via the menus in the software, that will be taken care of with regard to exempting that particular income, either in whole or a portion of it per se. So again, let the software do the driving, so to speak, and get you where you have to go with regard to filing your return. All right, next slide. Income types and taxability. This is sort of a duplicate of what we just talked about, but basically the biggest item that we need to think about on this particular slide is what we refer to as qualified scholarships or fellowships versus non-qualified scholarships or fellowships. And we'll talk about that distinction momentarily. But basically, as you can see, if you are receiving a qualified scholarship or fellowship, the taxability is, there's no taxability to that qualified scholarship or fellowship. Whereas if a portion of that scholarship or fellowship is deemed to be non-qualified, then it would be taxable. So we'll talk about that in 1 second, which let's go to the next slide. All right, income types and taxabilities continued. As I stated, we talk about qualified versus non-qualified scholarships. Basically, the bottom line is if you've received a qualified scholarship or fellowship, that portion of that scholarship, whether it be all of it or a portion of it, would be non-taxable. And the criteria that needs to be addressed here is if you are enrolled as a candidate for a degree at the university and the scholarship or fellowship is used to pay fees for enrollment, books, supplies, equipment as required for the course. So basically, for the most part, if you're receiving some type of fellowship or scholarship or some type of financial aid that is for those required fees, and those required fees primarily your tuition and other required fees, that would be non-taxable. Now, it's possible you may be getting some financial support that would be deemed non-qualified, and that would basically be taxable. And that typically includes primarily if you're receiving some type of stipend that is used for your living expenses, such as room and board. So that's the distinction. Generally speaking, the university will be providing you with the appropriate Form 1042-S to identify what is taxable. So that base is covered there. And when you ultimately get that Form 1042-S, that's in essence going to reflect what portion of your financial aid, so to speak, is taxable. So just keep that in mind. All right. All right, next slide. Talk briefly about tax treaties. And again, depending upon your situation, it's possible that some or a portion of your financial aid may be exempt, or in terms of payments that you might be receiving as a research assistant or a teaching assistant may be exempt based upon the treaties of your home country. So again, keep that in mind when you see that there is a possible treaty that might apply to you. Again, the Sprint tax software will highlight that for you and handle that properly when preparing your return. So hopefully, if there is a situation where some amount, maybe up to a limit, or the entire amount is exempt, that will show up on the Sprint tax return that you're preparing and properly handle that portion of that income that shouldn't be taxed under the circumstances. So that's certainly helpful to know. Keep that in mind and be cognizant of the fact that if there is a treaty provision, you want to see that exemption on the return. All right, next slide. Social Security numbers and ITIN numbers. I think Daryl might want to jump in here with regard, because I believe the university prefers that if you need an ITIN number that you go through the university. Is that correct, Daryl?
Yes, it is. And I have already been in touch with all of the incoming students or first-year students who should need an ITIN. If you are on your first-year fellowship, not an RA or not something else, but you're just on your first-year basic fellowship, and you're not working in the US or working on campus, then you don't qualify for a Social Security number and you must apply for the ITIN. We have information on our website on how to do that. It's a fairly streamlined process, but please keep in mind, the ITIN process goes through the IRS. And so that process is also very much delayed now. And from the time that someone submits an application, it might be 3 months before you get your ITIN. So if you have not started that process, start it now, please.
Okay, all right. Is that, in terms of that filing, I take it it's not electronic?
Not at all. Paper materials must be submitted
Submitted.
to the IRS. That's
Okay,
right.
okay, all right, okay, all right. Obviously, it's possible, I think at some point, if there is really no financial support at all, it's possible that if the only form you have to file is the 8843, you don't need an I-10, is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, so if in those circumstances, if there is no need to get the I-10, although I guess having it isn't necessarily a bad idea.
No, it makes people's lives easier. And if you have a bank account, once you have the I-10, you might be able to get full banking privileges.
Yeah, okay, all right. So, all right, what you're suggesting is to encourage all to at least apply for that. The need for social security number comes into play if you're being employed and you would then require to get a social security number. So you may need to cross that bridge at some point along the way if some employment activity takes place. All right, let's go to the next slide. State taxes. In addition to filing potentially a Form 1040-NR, it might be likely that you may have some Massachusetts source income while you're here that may need to be reported by way of a state income tax return. There's a couple of links there that you might want to go to sort of get an idea in terms of what that's all about. But again, we can sort of go back to the fact that you have the Sprint tax software, which is available to you, which will provide, if applicable, will provide you with the appropriate state income tax return that you may need to file under the circumstances. So you can certainly refer to that. Daryl, correct me if I'm wrong. Unfortunately, I believe, is there a fee for the filing of a Massachusetts return through Sprint tax?
Yes, that is correct. Our license only covers the federal return.
Okay.
And the fee for the state is going to be around $30.
Okay.
30 to $45.
Right. Yeah, for the most part, it's probably likely that there won't be a need for a state return. I suspect a great number of you may not have to file a state return, but if there's a circumstance where you would have to, again, it's the $30 is certainly well spent. Believe me. So if that happens to be the case, and the software determines that you, under the circumstances, determines that you should be filing a state income tax return, again, by all means, that $30 is certainly well spent. So just keep that in mind when and if the time comes. All right, next slide. All right, basically some sort of useful tips here and things that you might want to keep in mind. As I stated before, we can now file electronically, a non-resident file electronically. Again, that door might be limited to a few. And again, I need to sort of get up to date in terms of what that's all about, because I was under the understanding that any non-resident return can be. So we'll find out what's going on there with regard to those limitations. Next item, with regard to the Internal Revenue Service, basically, you will not get any type of confirmation that your return has been filed and processed. Obviously, if you're filing a return and you're getting a refund and you filed it electronically and you get your refund, guess what? That's pretty good confirmation of the fact that the return's been filed. So that's good in that respect. So they don't typically confirm the fact that you've filed a return. As a general rule, with regard to filing returns and basically the underlying documentation that you use to prepare your return, you should hold on to it for at least a 3-year period of time, which basically is the statute. The statute ends after 3 years, 3 years from the date you file your return. So once that occurs, typically, unless you've committed some substantial fraud with regard to filing a return, which I don't suspect will be the case, the bottom line is after 3 years, after filing the return, the door closes. The door closes on you to be able to go back incorrect or amend a return because you maybe made a mistake and you're entitled to more money, again, that door closes. And again, the door closes on the IRS if for some reason you underpaid your tax and they are looking for additional taxes. And there's exceptions to that, obviously, if, for example, as I said earlier, you file a fraudulent return of some sort. So, but basically, the rule of thumb is 3 years. It's over and done with. You can't go after them. They can't go after you. Now, if you've missed or filed an incorrect return, you can amend that return. Again, the door will close after 3 years, but if in the meantime, you discovered you haven't filed a return that you should have filed, or you need to amend a return because maybe you paid too much tax or too little, as the case may be, you can file what is known as an amended return within that window of time. So keep that in mind. The other thing is, if, for example, you haven't filed a return and you should have, there is in the law, the tax laws, the statute allows for the IRS to assess penalties and interest on that non-filed return. For example, keep in mind, and it happens all the time. For example, let's say you have some interest income you should have reported and you didn't. As I stated earlier, the government, the IRS is going to get a copy of that 1099 form, and they will at some point match that up to the return that you filed. That doesn't happen immediately. It's a year to a year and a half after you file the return that you might get notified of the fact that, oh, by the way, we were informed of the fact that you had interest income that you did not report on your return. The IRS will send you a notice informing you of that. And with that, unfortunately, there'll be assessment of some penalties and interest for underpaying the tax. All right, next slide. Dealing with the IRS, typically the IRS will initiate communications with the taxpayer by way of a paper notification. The IRS does not send out emails. The IRS does not make phone calls. So if you ever get emails stating that, oh, by the way, contact us because you've underpaid your tax, it's more than likely, it's definitely some type of scam of some sort. If you get a phone call, which I've received myself, which to be honest with you, I find rather amusing. I get a kick out of it, and I'll keep someone on the line to just sort of amuse myself. And then you'll ultimately realize that they should have, you got the wrong person. So they'll never reach out to you by phone. Now, that doesn't mean you can't communicate with them by phone. And basically, if you do communicate to them by phone, that can certainly happen. Needless to say, and it might be a call that you initiate to a phone number that may be in a written notice to you. So that's a possibility. Obviously, if you do communicate with the IRS, typically the individual that you reach on the other line will identify themselves, and they will in fact provide you with their identification number, their employee identification number. Make note of their name and identification number, because the conversation that you have, you can certainly rely on the information that they provide you, and it certainly doesn't hurt to be able to, if you need to follow up, be able to reach that individual or make reference to the fact that you were provided with certain information from that particular individual. All right, next slide. All right, if you do receive a notice from the IRS, basically read it carefully from a standpoint of what they're trying to convey to you. And basically, if you need to respond, you only need to respond if you disagree with what is reflected on the return. Again, for example, you filed a return, you forgot to report some interest income. Basically, the IRS will send you a notice. The notice will state that, in reviewing your return, you're not being examined, but basically in reviewing your return, there was an item item of income you fail to report. They'll identify that item that you failed to report. They will calculate the new tax that you would have to pay on that additional amount of income, plus some penalties, plus some interest. If you agree with them thoroughly, basically what you need to do is just simply respond to the notice by paying the additional amount due, and that's the end of it for you from that standpoint. If
Excuse
you
me,
want,
Bob.
yep, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that for any GSAS students, I'm always happy to help you review the IRS notices because they're not always 100% clear.
Yep.
Or at least students don't see them as being clear. So if you do get a notice, feel free to contact me. You can send it to me. I'll go through it and I'll tell you from my perspective what it is they're trying to communicate to you.
Sure. Yeah, understandable. Sometimes it's somewhat confusing. It can be confusing. And there's no necessarily to sort of be frightened by the fact that you received the notice and, oh my goodness, you know, I need to address this. I don't necessarily understand what it is, but basically, yeah, clearly understand what it's all about. As a matter of fact, I had a taxpayer recently send me up a notice from the IRS. And I was, when I say I was confused by it myself, I understood exactly what they were conveying. But the bottom line is the IRS indicated that the taxpayer did not report, in this particular taxpayer's case, the amount of Social Security that he had received, because for federal income tax purposes, a portion of one's Social Security is possibly taxable, and I'm not going to get into that. But clearly on the return that I prepared for the taxpayer, the amount was reflected there. So it was, in my mind, very confusing, and we basically responded to the IRS by sending them a copy of the page of the return reflecting the fact that we included it. I'm not sure what was going on here. So you don't have to necessarily acquiesce to what they have to say, fully understand what they're saying to you in the notice. And if you disagree with it, that's fine. That's fine. Communicate with them. They will provide you with how you need to respond, and just respond accordingly and leave it at that. So that's from that standpoint. And again, reach out to the IRS in that respect. All right, final slide. With regard to being selected, if you're selected for tax audit by the IRS, basically, the number of audits over the years have diminished to a very, very, very small percent. But basically, if you are selected for audit, it's possible that you may have been selected as sort of a target group. And what I mean by that is there may be matters reflected in your return that the IRS wants to do a sampling of, so that they can determine if taxpayers are handling matters correctly for purposes of future, maybe providing additional instructions and what have you. So it might be just for a sampling per se. So don't be alarmed by that. It's possible if you are audited for other reasons, you basically, again, as Daryl indicated, bring that notice to someone's attention, whether it be through Daryl's office, or if you want to reach out to me, that's possible as well, so that you fully understand the circumstances. You can certainly represent yourself with regard to presenting your case to the Internal Revenue Service. And if you certainly don't feel comfortable in doing that, then by all means, you know, you can hire someone to represent you with regard to that particular matter. So with that said, I think we've come to the end, and let's take a look at some of these questions that individuals may have.
Thanks, Bob. We had a couple of questions about the amount of time that people are in the United States and which way they should file. The first one was, what does the counting, how does counting work? I'm sorry. Yeah, how does counting the counting work if I had multiple F visas before? Do only calendar years count where I spent more than 183 days in the US?
Well, I think basically what would be helpful for that individual is to sort of consider entering the Glacier system. Is the Glacier system will come to, I believe, the conclusion of the fact that whether you're going to be treated as a resident or non-resident for a particular year, but I mean, basically the counting days, for example, as I understand it, if you were a student under an F visa, in Daryl, if you want to interject, you certainly can. But as I understand it, you have a 5-year time frame, and that 5-year time frame, that where you don't count days of presence, does not begin until the 6th calendar year. And then at that point in time, if you meet the requirements of being in the US for the requisite number of days, then you would be considered a resident for US tax purposes.
That is absolutely correct. And I would say that if you want to have a preliminary determination of what your tax status is, Glacier is the best way to do that. But please remember that Glacier is only making an assessment for Harvard. Glacier is not making any kind of assessment that will be transmitted to the federal government.
Yes.
The Sprint tax software separately will also make an assessment at the time that it's preparing your tax return. And almost always that assessment is going to be the same as what comes out of Glacier, because both systems are using the same whatever behind the scenes to figure out the status and the days.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously, if Sprint tax and going through the process using Sprint tax, it's determined or it's concluded that you would be a resident for US tax purposes, the use of that software is no longer available to you because it only addresses the filing of non-resident returns. If you find out that you would be treated as a resident US taxpayer, then you have to think about considering some other resource to prepare that return for you.
Okay, the next question is, if I spend more than 183 days in the US on an F1 visa, do I automatically become resident alien even though I'm on an F1 visa for less than 5 years? Or can I choose to file tax as a non-resident alien?
No, I mean, the counting of days, you don't have to count those days as if you're here under an F1 visa.
Okay,
Those days
So-
are not counted for that purpose.
So what I would say is that one thing you cannot do is choose to file as a resident. You cannot do that.
No,
Residents get tax benefits that non-residents are not eligible for. Therefore, if you are a non-resident, you must file as a non-resident.
exactly.
And with the whole thing about counting days always gets me mixed up. There is a little, and unfortunately, there is no such thing as a substantial presence test calculator that I've ever been able to find. But if you go to publication 519 at the IRS, it gives you how they say you should calculate the time over the span of I think it's 3 years going back. But it is true that if you come to the US, if this is the first time that you have ever come to the US, other than being a student and you're here in an F1 status, you will not start to count towards the substantial presence test 183 days for 5 years. And the 5 year starts with 2022.
okay,
Correct. I agree. Exactly.
okay. For PhD students, is a stipend a form of income, or would we have an official formal, or would we have an official formal income until we have a, I think they were asking, is a stipend taxable, or is my stipend income not taxable, but my income from teaching is taxable?
Okay, bottom line, any money that you get is income. All income is taxable unless there is an applicable tax treaty that exempts some of that money from taxation. The only monies that students are given, which they don't actually receive, that is not taxable, is going to be their tuition scholarships.
Okay, so where would a student know how much to claim on their taxes?
They're not, that's the role of the software.
Okay, great. Okay.
Yeah, if they're receiving payments through the university, there, as I understand it, there is access to, I'm not sure how to call it, but the payroll system, which will provide you with what I identify as sort of a pay stub that's available to them, which will identify the specific amounts that they're receiving. And I've often seen them and often referred to them, and they would be identified on that pay stub, I believe, as a stipend amount.
So the problem is that at Harvard, different pots of money can be called the same thing. So we really don't know what kind of money we're talking about. So some students are actually, working. Some students get non-compensatory fellowship money that's still taxable. It's just non-compensatory.
Yeah.
Okay. For international students, do we file for taxes in our home country first and then file for taxes in the US? How does that work?
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, no, I mean, basically, if they have a responsibility, and it's nothing we can address here, because for me to fully understand the numerous countries that have taxing provisions, basically, if they have a responsibility to file an income tax return in their home country, then by all means, they have to go through that process. Now, there are treaties and provisions where obviously what you want to avoid is certainly double taxation. If there's income that they have to report to their home country, that also has to be reported on a U.S. return. There is typically provisions where there is a way to eliminate double taxation, either by not reporting on either respective return or by taking a tax credit on one or the other return to eliminate that double taxation. So, and for the most part, that's generally addressed. I mean, there's certainly the acknowledgement of the fact that those that have treaty provisions, they do have paragraphs or provisions in the treaties that address the avoidance of double taxation, no question.
Okay. And I think our last question is, can I claim expenses to reduce my tax return? I think that's, they're meaning to lower their taxable income.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, that's,
I'm sorry, Bob, before you answer that.
yeah, go ahead.
I think in some corners of the institution, students are told that they can claim their moving expenses to the US as a tax deduction.
That's interesting. I'm not so sure that might necessarily be an accurate statement, but a lot goes on with regard to that. I mean, the only expenses that a graduate student could possibly use to reduce their income is if they're paying what would be deemed qualified educational expenses out of their pocket.
I can give an example.
Go ahead.
So you're in a program and your program requires that you have a computer, but the program is not going to provide you with the computer and you have to buy it out of pocket. Then the cost of that computer can be claimed as a deduction, as an educational deduction on your taxes.
Yeah, and I've used that example before. Obviously, if there's some additional and you're at the particular slide, basically, if any portion, and this would be essentially, the bottom line is this: with regard to specific tuition and fees, the university gives you credit for that, and you don't see, touch, or feel that money. Basically, it goes against what is owed with regard to specific tuition and fees. But it's possible, if the particular course or program of study does require that you incur expenses that are specific to certain supplies and equipment and so forth, then that would be deemed as a qualified educational expense. And if that money came out of your pocket or out of your stipend or wherever it came out of your piggy bank, that would be considered a qualified educational expense, and you can use that to reduce whatever taxable fellowship or scholarships that you receive during the course of the year. So you can certainly keep that in mind. If you need to buy a new BMW to get you to class, that wouldn't be a deductible expense against your income.
Okay. I worked at another university until May this year. How should I report this part of my income?
Worked at another university, if we're talking about this individual being a non-resident, which I assume is the case, when they file their form, when they utilize the Sprint tax software, they will enter that W-2 wage information into the tax software when asked. So for that individual, you should receive a W-2 form if it's for compensation for services rendered. You should get the W-2 form from that university, and it should be entered into the Sprint tax software as part of their taxable income.
Okay, great. That is all the questions that have been posted in the chat. Bob or Daryl, is there anything additional that you'd like to add to any of this?
No, just again, make sure that you have your I-10 for tax filing, or if you're already working on campus as an RA or a TA or working at the library, you can apply for an SSN. Keep an eye out for the tax messaging that's going to start in January. And since I'm the tax man at the HIO, if you have questions, you can be in touch with me.
And from my standpoint, again, if anyone has any questions subsequent to this presentation, which is about to end, obviously feel free to reach out through my email account, and I'll be more than happy to help you out.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Robert Underwood and Daryl Ziegler from the International Office. This has been so helpful. Thank you again very much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure. Daryl, thank you. Have a good day.
You too, Bob. Take care.
Take care.
Bye, everyone. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.